Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Zechariah in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. You remember we talked about the last three books of the Old Testament, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, and we described these three as the post-exilic prophets. That is, these are the prophets that prophesy, they minister after the Israelites have come back from the Babylonian captivity. So they're back in the land of Judah, and it's in that setting that we see these prophecies. The temple has been rebuilt. In fact, we remember that Haggai and Zechariah prophesy, and as a result of their prophesying in Ezra chapter 5, the Jews continue and complete the work of rebuilding the temple. And we saw that Haggai addresses that issue directly, but now we're going to look at Zechariah, who addresses it in a far different way. He does it through dreams and visions. Zechariah chapters 1 through 6, and we'll look at the rest of Zechariah under a separate heading, but it begins with 8 visions, and notice that there is a certain symmetry to these visions that we have in chapter 1 verse 1, 4 horsemen. When we get down to chapter 6 verse 1, there's going to be corresponding to that 4 chariots. In chapter 1 verse 18 we have horns and smiths, and these are signs of judgment. Likewise, we have in chapter 5 verse 1 a flying scroll, signs of judgment. And then in chapter 2 verse 1 there's a measuring line, and the warning there is to flee Babylon because some bad things are going to happen in Babylon. Likewise, in chapter 5 verse 5 there's a vision of a woman and a basket, and that represents Shinar, which is just another name for the land of Babylon. And then right in the middle of this section, in chapters 3 and chapters 4, we have 2 people who represent the people of God. First, Joshua the high priest. This isn't Joshua who brought the walls of Jericho down. This is another Joshua, much later in history. He's the high priest of the Jews. And then there is also Zerubbabel, the descendant of King David. Although Zerubbabel himself is not a king. He is a governor, he's a leader, but he's not a king. And we see him in a vision with a golden lampstand. Those are temple visions in the middle. Well, let's start in chapter 1 verse 8 where Zechariah says, I saw at night, and behold, a man was riding on a red horse, and he was standing among the myrtle trees which were in the ravine, with red, sorrel, and white horses behind him. So the vision begins where there are 4, can I call them 4 horsemen, 4 horses with different colored horses. Then I said, My Lord, what are these? And the angel who was speaking with me said to me, I will show you what these are. Here they are. And the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered and said, These are those whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth. So they answered the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees and said, We have patrolled the earth. These are God's spokesmen. These are God's messengers. And they go out and they patrol the earth, and their report is they come back to the Lord, and behold, all the earth is peaceful and quiet. This was a quiet time in the history of the world. Relatively quiet. Now, Zechariah chapter 1, we saw the 4 horsemen there. In Zechariah chapter 6, we already mentioned there's 4 chariots. And you remember when Revelation chapter 6 comes along, John's going to have a vision of 4 horsemen again. So in Zechariah chapter 1, these are multicolored horsemen. They are red, and sorrel, and white. When we get to chapter 6, even though we've changed from 4 horsemen to 4 chariots, again they are different colors. They are red and white and black and dappled. And that reminds us that when we get to Revelation chapter 6 in the end of the New Testament, that again we're going to have 4 horsemen riding different colored horses, and the horses will be white and red and black and ashen, although some translators suggest maybe that is more of a pale green that's being described there. In in Zechariah chapter 1, these 4 horsemen are sent out by God to patrol the earth. And they come back and they say everything is peaceful and quiet. And likewise in Zechariah chapter 6, we read that these are 4 spirits of heaven going out to patrol the earth. In other words, these are God's horsemen or God's chariots. And they go forth, and you get the same sense. Everything is still sort of peaceful. Might not say that way, but it is right now. Revelation chapter 6, when those 4 horsemen go out, everything is not peaceful. It is not nice. There's war, and there's conquest, and there's famine, and there's death, and lots of bad things. These are called by the 4 living creatures around the throne, and they're going out to represent the Lord again and to do His work and His will. Now we come to Zechariah chapter 3, and now we see again one of those people visions. Chapters 3 and chapter 4 are going to have that. Chapter 3 will be Joshua. Chapter 4 will be Zerubbabel. In chapter 3, verse 1, then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord. And there's another person there. And Satan was standing at his right hand to accuse him. There's a play on words here. Ha-Satan is the Hebrew there. The enemy, we could translate it, or the accuser standing at his right hand to enemy him, to accuse him, lesitnu, and it's the same word, just with a slightly different arrangement, but it's exactly the same word. So there's a play on words here. Satan is the accuser. His name means that. He is the enemy, and he's here to be the enemy. Verse 2, and the Lord said to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, Satan. Indeed, the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not, speaking of Jerusalem, is this not a brand plucked from the fire? Now Joshua, and here's the problem, Joshua was clothed with filthy garments and standing before the angel. You know, it's one thing when Satan falsely accuses you. It's another thing when he accuses you and there is some justification to the accusation. Because here's Joshua, he's clothed with filthy garments. His garments aren't supposed to be filthy. They're supposed to be spotless. They're supposed to be priestly garments. And yet they reflect something wrong with them. Remember that Joshua does what a priest always does. He's representing the people to God. And his garments are filthy because the people whom he has represented themselves are filthy. They have sinned. We have all sinned. We've all fallen short of God's glory. Verse 4, and he spoke and said to those who were standing before him, saying, remove the filthy garments from him. And again he said to him, see, I have taken your iniquity away from you, and will clothe you with festal robes. So the filthy robes are removed from Joshua, and he is given new robes. It's a picture of what God has done to his people. He has removed our robes of filthiness. He has removed our sin, and he has clothed us with wonderful robes of delight. We are clothed now in the very righteousness of Jesus Christ through faith in him because of his work upon the cross. So this is looking ahead to that forgiveness that they would enjoy. It reminds us in Revelation chapter 19, verses 7 and 8, where we have that wonderful vision of the marriage of the Lamb. Let us rejoice and be glad and give the glory to him, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen. Where did she get the fine linen? The Lord provided it, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Notice these are the things that we do, and yet we do them because the Lord has provided them in our lives. Zechariah chapter 3, verse 8, now listen, Joshua the high priest, you and your friends who are sitting in front of you, they are men who are a symbol. If you didn't get that this was symbolic, we're going to be told right here that it is. These are a symbol, for behold, I am going to bring in my servant, the branch. That is something that has been referenced earlier in the prophets. Isaiah chapter 4, verse 2, in that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth will be the pride and the adornment of the survivors of Israel. Likewise, Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 5 and 6, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely, and this is his name by which he will be called the Lord our righteousness. Where do we get the righteous robes? Here it is, from the Lord who is our righteousness. But notice the picture here. The picture is of a branch, and it is a branch from David. You see, it's describing, the picture is of a tree, a great and wondrous tree that has been chopped down. And the line of David likewise has been chopped down. The kings are now at an end. There are no more kings of Judah, because they have been carried off into captivity. And even when they come back from captivity, again there are no kings of Judah. But from that dead stump, as it were, grows a shoot, a branch, a little growth that's going to spring up and is going to rise up for David, this righteous branch who's going to reign as king. Zechariah chapter 3 verses 9 and 10, for behold the stone that I have set before Joshua, on one stone are 7 eyes, behold I will engrave an inscription on it, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. We're still talking about the branch, but notice our metaphors have changed. Verse 10, in that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to sit under his vine and under his fig tree. That's symbolic language for the good old days. Back when in Solomon's day it was said that things were so nice that everybody was able to be under his vine and under his fig tree. And so it's described again in the future when the Lord comes, when this righteous branch comes, on whom will have an inscription engraved. Then the angel who was speaking with me returned and roused me as a man who is awakened from his sleep. We're going to see that engraving in just a second. He said to me, what do you see? And I said, I see, and behold, here's a new vision, behold a lampstand all of gold with its bowls on the top of it, and its 7 lamps on it with 7 spouts belonging to each of the lamps which are on the top of it, also 2 olive trees by it, one on the right side of the bowl, and the other on its left side. So a vision of 2 olive trees, and in the middle is a lampstand with 7 bowls holding the oil for the lamp. Now, the lampstand it's a heavenly vision, but it's a temple vision. Because where do you see a 7-sprouted lampstand in sort of the form of a tree? You see that in the temple. This is temple language. But here it's described between 2 olive trees. Then I answered and said to the angel who was speaking with me, saying, what are these? He doesn't have to ask about the lampstand so much. He can sort of get that. But what are these? So the angel who was speaking with me answered and said to me, do you not know what these are? And I said, no, my Lord. Zechariah asked, I'm not sure what these are. So what are they? Verse 6, then he answered and said to me, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, saying, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. Notice Zerubbabel hasn't really been mentioned now, but now he's brought into focus. Zerubbabel was the descendant of David. The descendant of David who, yes, has the legal right to be on the throne, but he's not on the throne because there are no more kings of Judah. Verse 7, what are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you will become a plain, and he will bring forth the top stone with shouts of grace, grace to it. There's something coming from Zerubbabel, something that will take a mountain and flatten it. Something wonderful is coming from Zerubbabel. Verse 8, also the word of the Lord came to me, saying, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, and his hands will finish it. This is talking about the temple. Remember, this is in the context of rebuilding the temple. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. Verse 10, for who has despised the day of small things? But these 7 will be glad when they see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. These are the eyes of the Lord which range to and fro throughout the earth. So even though the rebuilding of the temple, you look at it and it just doesn't, like Haggai had said, it just doesn't seem to be all that it could be. But it's a small thing that will give rise eventually to a great thing. And notice we're talking both the physical temple that was being built there, but I think there's more than that. I think there is a spiritual temple that's going to be built, also coming from Zerubbabel, not that he will personally build it, but that will be one of his descendants, that righteous branch, that one who would stand up in the temple many years later and who would say, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rise it up. And of course he was speaking of the temple of his body, and that was the ancestor of Zerubbabel. Then I answered and said to him, what are these 2 olive trees on the right of the lampstand and on its left? I sort of get the lampstand, it's a picture of God's light and life, and so, sort of reminds us of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I'm sorry, the tree of life. There was also the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but the tree of life that was in the garden, a tree of life, a tree of light, and there was even a cherubim was stationed there with a flaming sword, giving light. But what are these 2 olive trees on the right of the lampstand and on the left? They have not yet been explained. And I answered the second time and said to him, what are the two olive tree branches which are beside the two golden pipes which empty the golden oil from themselves? Notice they supplied oil from, olive trees supplying olive oil. And that in itself is a vivid picture. And so he answered me saying, do you not know what these are? And I said, no, my Lord. And then he said, these are the two anointed ones, literally the sons of oil, but actually that's a Hebrewistic phrase that means anointed ones. So we're going to stick with that translation. These are the two anointed ones who are standing by the Lord of the whole earth. What are these two anointed ones? Revelation chapter 11 talks about two witnesses and references this passage when it does so. And notice that Zerubbabel and, in the chapter previously, Joshua represented the people of God. And it seems like perhaps these do too, that these represent the people of God. Those who are sons of oil, these who are containers for the Spirit of God and are anointed ones standing by the Lord of the whole earth. Now we come to Zechariah chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. We see that the word of the Lord also came to me, saying, take an offering from the exiles, from Heldai, Tobiah, from Jedediah, and you go on the same day and enter the house of Josiah, the son of Zephaniah, where they have arrived from Babylon, and take silver and gold, and make an ornate crown, and set it on the head of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Then say to him, thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, a man whose name is Branch, for he will branch out from where he is, and he will build the temple of the Lord. Yes, it is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he who will bear the honor, and sit and rule on his throne. Thus he will be a priest on his throne, and the council of priests will be between the two offices. Now notice the prophecy. On the one hand, you have what's known as the Netzer, the high priestly crown that's described in Exodus chapter 29, verse 6. But here you have a different word, the Atara, that speaks more to a kingly crown. This is initially fulfilled in the Hasmonean rulers. Those rulers were initially known by the nickname the Maccabees, that is the rocks on which the Greek overlords were broken. But their family name were the Hasmoneans, and this was a priestly tribe that rose up after the temple had been desecrated. Remember we talked about that story back in Daniel chapter 11. And this was fulfilled by these priests who took on the role of rulers and eventually became known not just as priests, but kings as well. However, I think ultimately it's fulfilled in the person of Jesus. He is the ultimate priest-king. First of all, we notice the promise that he will branch out, or I think a better translation might be, he will sprout up. Again, the image is of a tree that's been cut down, and from that stump branches out or sprouts up or grows up this little twig that becomes a great tree. And Jesus is the one who springs from the broken stump of Jesse, the fallen house of David, and rebuilds that to become the new king. He will build the temple, chapter 6, verse 13. And of course, Jesus was able to stand in the temple in Jerusalem and say, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And of course, he was speaking of the temple of his body. He will rule, and Jesus both came to do that and will come again to do that. We're told in the New Testament that there's coming a day when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord. He will be both priest and king. In fact, we could add to that prophet, priest, and king, but here in this prophecy, the two offices that are being described are that of priest and that of king, and Jesus fulfills both of them. Those who are far off will come and build the temple, chapter 6, verse 15 of Zechariah, and we are part of that group who is far off. And the New Testament talks about how we are the building blocks. We are the living stones that are being built into a grand and glorious holy temple. And so we conclude in verse 15, those who are far off will come and build the temple of the Lord. Now, the latter part of Zechariah, we had the 8 visions that we've already looked at in chapter 1 through 6. In chapters 7 through 12, we have 2 sermons. There's a call for true justice and a promise of future restoration. And then 2 burdens. There's judgment on the enemies of Israel, and then the coming of the Lord. And that's that last part that we were going to look at and focus on right now. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 1, Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, and the houses plundered, and the woman ravished, and half of the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Hard times that are being depicted here. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. In that day his feet, speaking of the Lord, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will move toward the north and the other half toward the south. Now, the Mount of Olives is a literal place. If you stand here, as I'm standing when I took this photo, on the Temple Mount and just look to the east, there's this big valley separating them, but then on the other side of the valley there you can see the Mount of Olives actually towering over the Temple Mount. It's quite a bit higher than the Temple Mount. And here's just from the other side, standing on the Mount of Olives and looking toward the Temple Mount. Today, on that mount, you see the Dome of the Rock, where the temple used to stand back in Old Testament times, and again, even in New Testament times, after it had been rebuilt. Now, some interpretations of this passage. The first 2 are historical views, and I think perhaps that they might be indeed a foreshadowing of this prophecy. I'm not sure that the entire prophecy is fulfilled in that, but first of all, there is what we can call the Esther incident. In Esther chapter 9, we read of a great conflict that arose against the Jews, and of course the whole book of Esther is talking about that, where the Jews were going to be exterminated, and at the end the Jews are allowed to defend themselves, and it might be that this prophecy foreshadows a bit of that. Secondly, we've already mentioned the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans, and we saw how that played out when we were looking at our review of the book of Daniel. And likewise, there was a time when the Jews faced great enemies, surrounded by enemies in the days of the Maccabees, and the Lord was with them. Now there wasn't any miraculous sorts of things happening that were visibly miraculous, but the Lord, I believe, was with them, and they gained their independence against a much greater foe. And I think that was the hand of the Lord and the working of the Lord in their midst. And so those have been adopted as 2 interpretations of this prophecy in Zechariah chapter 14. Another view that's been suggested, at least, is that this is a symbolic view of the church, where the gospel goes forth from Jerusalem and reaches out to all the nations. And certainly it does that, but the details in this prophecy seemed to go beyond what would be warranted for merely such a symbolic view. And so I think many interpreters, I'm not sure if we could say most, but probably most interpreters, adopt a futuristic view of this passage, and I think perhaps for good reason, that it pictures Jesus returning in his second coming, something that is maybe prefigured in the Esther incident, maybe prefigured in the Maccabee revolt, where God certainly worked for his people, delivered his people, but the ultimate deliverance, I think is still future. And so I think that we can look at Zechariah chapter 14 as, yes, things that God did in the past, but especially that he's going to do still in the future when Christ returns. You will remember that in Acts chapter 1, when Jesus was caught up into the heavens, and 2 men robed in white I take them to be perhaps angelic angels. Messengers appeared to the disciples and said, "Why do you stand gazing up to into heaven? The same Jesus who has been taken up, so in the same manner will come again." And if it's indeed the same manner, Acts chapter 1 tells us that took place on the Mount of Olives. Indeed, I think it could very well be that Jesus comes back to the same location in his second coming.